Hello and welcome to this edition of Table Talk, a series of conversations organized by the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I am Pande and my co-host is Susan Haris. We are a group of scholars and activists with an interest in the question of the animal. And today it gives me great pleasure to invite Amit Baishya from the University of Oklahoma. We will be discussing Amit's article, Endangered and Endangering Species, exploring the Animacy Hierarchy in Malik Sajad's Munnu. So a very hearty welcome to you, Amit.
Thank you very much, and a great honor for me that you invited me to talk in this session. I see the illustrious list of names, and I kind of feel the pressure of keep living up to those standards as well. So thank you so much.
Well, I am not familiar, I must admit, with Munnu, the text, the graphic novel. But based on what I read in your article about it, I found it very interesting that Munnu does not only present stray dogs symbolically, but also as quotidian, ordinary, and material presences who survive in inconspicuous ways in necropolitical conditions. In fact, if one were to remove the necropolitical conditions in Munnu, then the feral packs chasing a person could actually be a scene from quotidian life, which conforms pretty closely to the material existence and behavior of dogs living on the streets just about anywhere. So I agree with what you say in the article that it is more the Fanonian frame of necropolitical surveillance that leads to Kashmiris being seen as an alter species here and the dogs as cohorts of necro power. I thought today we could perhaps start with what you call the triangulated animacy hierarchy, the human, hungul, and canine in Munnu, where the humans are the military personnel or the other Indians as well. The Hanguls are the endangered, vulnerable, and animalized Kashmiris, and the dogs are ambivalent presences who are often aggressive. But on one occasion, we see them also forging an alliance with another vulnerable figure who is homeless and also stray in that sense. The cognitively disabled woman who is vulnerable at multiple levels, being a woman and being cognitively disabled and being Kashmiri, is then raped by an auto rickshaw driver and his friends. So where in the animacy hierarchy would you place her?
Okay, let me get back to the let me try to address this question first with the animacy hierarchy question, and then I'll get to the closure, because the scene that you talk about is more towards the end. And actually, I've tried to read it in two different ways, because there is both the essay that you read on endangered and endangering species, and there's one which is coming out in the Critical Kashmir Studies Reader, where I try to read it in a slightly different way, right? Because I think it's open to multiple interpretations. But first, let me talk about the animacy hierarchy, right? So when you read Munnu, I think I picked I picked it up around 2018 when I was looking to teach a graphic novel on the Indian context, especially in a class where I kind of merged graphic novels with cinema generally, right? It was not an animal studies class, and I guess the first reaction for anyone who reads Munnu is that the comparison will immediately be mouse, right? That mouse would be, the Germans are cats and the Jews are mice, right? Here, on the other hand, the Indians are humans and the Hangul and the Kashmiris are Hanguls, right? So endangered species. So this idea of endangered species, and there is a chapter called Endangered Species in the novel as well. And so my first thought was, okay, so do we read it as kind of like through the lens that Maus gives us, right? That the animalization of the human with particular characteristics, but Art Spiegelman also making a critique of American consumer culture through, let's say, the Mickey Mouse figure and all that stuff. But then something odd began to surface as I was reading it over and over again. And this kind of takes me back to something I did earlier. So the connections could be drawn from there. My first monograph, which was on necropolitics in Northeast India, and I'm from Northeast India, right? And in fact, Munnu is the only Kashmiri text I've read, so I can't call myself a specialist in Kashmiri literature, and I make that very clear as well. But when I was reading a lot of literature from Northeast India, um, what was interesting, of course, my whole angle of coming into animal studies was through the animalization of the human, right? So the idea that when you're tortured, for instance, you are like an animal, right? You become rendered like an animal. Or let's say when you're reading even people like Jean Améry, or you're reading torture narratives from Northeast India, you know, or very often, you squeal like a pig, right? Or that kind of similitude becomes very central. But what was odd in a lot of the stories that I was reading, the Assamese stories that I was reading in my book, was that animal figures are often coming on, right? Actual animal figures. So the problem was, the puzzle was how to read it. And very often they were lying at the edge of the frame. And my favorite story there was a story that I had translated as well by Jairul Hussain. It's called Old Himalayan, Old Himalayan, which I translated as minor sorry, uh, minor. I keep forgetting the title as well. It was minor play and major play, right? So Old Himali, Bod Himali. So it's about a corpse that comes floating down the river, right? And a group of children take it out of the river. They try to bring the corpse back to life, but there's a little snail which is attached to the corpse's pocket, and the children just throw the snail away. And the snail actually appears in only 3 sentences in the story. But the last sentence is, as the children are trying to bring the corpse back to life, the immobile snail starts to move away, right? So here's the snail at the edge of the frame, right? And the whole puzzle was, why end the story with a sentence about the snail while the whole story is actually about the corpse and the children, right? Which kind of led, if I were to call it, to a kind of uh, you know method, if we may call it that way, right? That how do you use the animal which is at the edge of the frame to actually kind of focus on the diegetic space itself. Same thing happened in Munnu. If you think about the stray dogs, they are not major participants in the story. They are usually at the edge of the frames. Sometimes they come into the center. Sometimes they're there as symbolic kind of manifestations. But the other problem, of course, is that that they were not really major propellers of the plot per se, but they were there, right? On the one hand, they were creating a sense of place in Srinagar, which other graphic novels did not do. The other way of thinking about it was that they appear at crucial times in the story, just like at the closure, just like the snail comes back in the last sentence. You have that last scene with the disabled woman and the dogs. So this kind of puzzled me again, right? How do you work this through? And then, as I was thinking about the role of dogs, the other issue that I started noticing was that very often in these situations of necropolitical occupation, where human beings are often humiliated, right? They are often walking on all fours, right? They're often made to walk on all fours, right? So you have lots of scenes there where the Hanguls are made to walk on all fours, right? Either they are walking on all fours or they are in a prostrate kind of condition, right? So effectively, the Indian soldiers who are then drawn as humans kind of make them kind of, crawl or bend or prostrate themselves, right? As they're going through these things. So this brought up another thing. You have a four-legged creature, which is a dog, right? You have the hangul, which is kind of caught in the middle, right? Either walking on 2 legs or being forced to become prostrate or to crawl, right? Again, that is an interesting connection that came up over and over again. And then in the middle of the graphic novel, there's a segment which talks about the history of Kashmir, right? It kind of starts with a mythic history, right? The Rishi came out of the lake and all that stuff. And then you have those inset panels where there are Hanguls on 4 legs. But at the end of the page, the Hangul starts moving from 4 legs to 2 legs. So it's almost like a narrative of speciation, right? So this kind of began to interest me, like this whole question of 4-legged beings, 2-legged beings. And of course, the immediate connection there was Freud with civilization and discontent, which is the fable with which I begin the essay as well. That that famous note in Civilization and Discontent, he said that the metaphysical mark, let's put it that way, of the distinction between humanity and animality is when the human moves on 2 legs as opposed to the animal which kind of moves on 4 legs and so on. So I started with that problematic to kind of open up this whole question of what the role of the dogs would be. And that brought me into interesting kind of dimension, that on the one hand, they often appeared symbolically, like in that scene where you saw where Munnu is going with his mother, and you have the female dog suckling her puppies. So it's a kind of like this kind of archetypal image of motherhood, right? There are these images which there are these encounters with dogs, like there is that scene with the dogs fornicating, when the child Munnu begins to feel disgust, and this disgust kind of again, he looks down, and then at that point of time he begins to, there's a rising sense of his own sense of being human, so to speak, in one way that was there. But the dogs are also interestingly fugitive heralds of freedom. On the one hand, there were these things, and also tools of the Indian occupation, right? Because in Kashmir, of course, dogs are often thought, stray dogs especially, are often thought of as tools of the Indian occupation. My friend Mona Bhan's essay on the stray dogs in counterinsurgency actually came after the Munnu essay, but I've used that in my second essay as well. But when they do this ethnographic study, and Mohammed Junaid has actually done, and we've talked about this as well, about the role of dogs at different levels. So there were these multiple levels. On the one hand, tools of the colonial occupiers. On the other hand, the dog's material way of being as a way of kind of escaping the frame, so to speak, as fugitive heralds of freedom. But then the puzzle came in, about that last portion again, right? Kind of brings us back to the full circle, to the closure, right? Why end that scene? And it's quite a difficult scene to read, and it's, my students still struggle with it when I teach it, for instance. It seems like they are almost being prepared for Munnu's growth as an artist, right? He's the politicized artist. He's talking about, there's a tea loss which is going on, right? Like a classic Kunstler Roman, like, let's say, portrait of an artist as a young man or something like that. Like he's coming into being as an artist. And then suddenly those last two pages completely overturn everything around, right? Everything is in darkness. He's being chased by the dogs. Suddenly there is this light which illuminates this dark frame, right? And you have the auto rickshaw, right? And there are two people standing outside, and he wants to take the auto rickshaw to go back to Batamalu. And they stop him, and he smells, there's the smell of stinking guts. And then the woman is thrown out like a piece of trash. She's being sexually assaulted inside the auto rickshaw. And then again, the first shot, the scene that we see of the woman is on all fours, right? Again, we can think of it through this question of four-legged versus two-legged, the whole tropes that keeps on working up. And then Munnu doesn't know what to do, that these three men who are saying, oh, she's just a disabled woman, right? She's just a disabled woman. We were just warming ourselves up. They were saying that, right? But in the meantime, the woman stands up, right? And then the dogs fall silent. And one of the dogs she cradles in her lap, and then they walk away into the darkness. So what I find very interesting in that framework was this idea that in some sense there is a form of interspecies kind of kinship which happens very contingently, right? Between a woman who is animalized and between animals who are treated as feral, right? But in some ways you can see almost as elements outside that hierarchy that we have established, right? A kind of contingent notion of connection coming in. And this I was drawing a little bit on recent research on the connections between disability and animality, right? Especially people like Sunaura Taylor, right? Who's Beasts of Burden. She has this wonderful image, of course, which I've kind of used in different essays as well, where she says that I have my dog Brandy who roots with her nose, right? And I don't have hands, but when, for instance, I have to take my cell phone out from this, I feel a shared kinship with the dog, right? I feel a shared kinship with the dog. And this is the way in which there's a way of claiming animal by disability right activists as well, right? Not the pejorative sense in which disabled people are always compared with animal, but this idea of claiming animal, which I think has come to be a big kind of ethical move, if you may put it that way, in disability theory. So that's the connection I was trying to make with the eventual kind of closure. Sorry, long-winded description which goes back and forth, but I hope that kind of answers the question about how those connections came into being.
Yes, and we love long-winded answers. No one, short two-sentence answers are not what we are looking for. So I'm really happy. Referring to the same scene, of the woman being thrown out of the auto rickshaw after she's assaulted, and she landing on all fours. You also talk in that episode, or about that episode, and you talk about the bleed between biopolitical and zoopolitical and necropolitical conditions. That I found really interesting also, the fact that the perpetrators
Mhm,
are themselves brutalized and
mhm,
animalized as
mhm,
special men,
mhm,
but then they in turn also end up brutalizing another and
mhm,
animalizing her.
mhm.
So maybe you could elaborate on this bleed a little bit for us.
Yeah. When I said the bleed between biopolitical and zoopolitical, of course, here the key angle is to think both with Foucault and Mbembe, but also to move a little bit beyond that, so to speak, in some ways, right? I mean, if we think about colonial biopolitics, so to speak, in some ways, right, or occupational, the biopolitics of occupation, of spatial occupation in some sense, it's always about bodies that are being controlled and being hemmed in at all points of time. And that's why the Fanonian frame, I think, becomes useful there, because to move through occupied territory, right, in some sense, is to internalize and to be the subject, so to speak, of various forms of biopolitical control, right? But the bleed between the biopolitical and the zoopolitical could come in, and I'll come to the other part of the question about like the woman being brutalized. But to begin with this question, like the bleed between the biopolitical and the zoopolitical is, and of course, this is something that I would probably even remember from some of my youthful experiences in Guwahati, right? Especially in 1990s, when, for instance, from the train station, you'd move to your house and there would be 5 different checkpoints, right? And in the checkpoints, of course, this is the classic kind of biopolitical mechanism, right? Where your body is surveilled, where your body is checked, and so on. But the first thing they'll ask you is the ID card, right? The first thing they'll ask you is the ID card. Their security system is the ID card, so to speak, in some sense. And I've thought about it in different ways, like that in some sense, the ID cards are like clothes, right? Ananya Vajpayee writes about this in her essay on the ASPA in Manipur, right? But you could also take it in the more Arendtian sense that it gives you a face, a legal face, a persona, so to speak, in some ways, right? The first thing you want to do is to show your ID card. And of course, this happens even in airports in the US, especially brown bodies and black bodies when they move, for instance, through surveillance spaces. You need to have your ID in front of you because you are more liable to be stopped as raised bodies, so to speak, in some sense. I mean, of course, we can think also about police violence in the United States through that framework as well. But to give you that example, right, like when in the 90s, when militarization was at its height in Guwahati, and we would come as students back from Delhi, get down at the Guwahati railway station, there would be about 5 checkpoints, right? And in each of them, there is a ritual. Both the person who checks you and the person who's checked knows that ritual very familiarly. You're patted down, especially if you're a young male, you'll be patted down, you know from top to bottom, so to speak, and then you'll do the ID card. And I've noticed, for instance, people who did not have ID cards were just brutally taken away, right? Now that's where you can almost see, for instance, the person who did not have that ID card of some sort or some kind of identification would be caught by the scruff of the neck and almost made prostrate on the side of the sidewalk. Something which happens in Munnu as well. The man moves outside without his ID card and then he's sprawling on all fours like an animal, right? So this idea is that this whole idea of a legal persona, the way in which it endows you with a human face, that can be stripped away to reveal your metaphorical animal self. You can be animalized. That's the bleed that I'm talking about in some ways, right? That's the bleed that you see at different points of time in Munnu as well. When he's traveling, for instance, he has the journalist's ID. He moves through. Sometimes it's not even adequate. And in fact, um, the Muhammad Junaid essay, counter mapping of the ordinary, is so fascinating to read with Munnu in that light as well, that when he's going with his mother, they have to improvise strategies to actually go through different checkpoints because they know in advance that if they don't have this at this point of time, so the mother would even carry her x-rays to say, I have an x-ray, right? I have to go to the hospital, so to speak. Because if you don't have that, you could easily be detained, you could easily be animalized in the zoopolitical sense, and you are treated like an animal, so to speak, right? And that happens to Munnu as well when he's almost about to lick the boots of the officer to let his mother go to hospital, so to speak. And therefore there's that constant bleed if we think about it in terms of the biopolitical and the zoopolitical. But when we think of sovereign imaginaries, and this is, of course, I think a kind of correct analysis, both in terms of the Northeast and also in terms of Kashmir. And this is the comparative thing that I would like to do, is to say that when we talk, for instance, even of ordinary life, or for instance, even about independentist groups, they are proto kind of proto, I'm sorry about this. Let me just put this off. They are also kind of proto sovereign or quasi sovereign entities in their own right, with their own disciplinary kind of formations. And also, let's face it, they are all of them patriarchal as well. Let's say if you go to Manipur, for instance, the aspect that you are forced to wear, for instance, a particular type of cloth, especially as if you're a woman. And the same thing happened in Assam as well, in the rural areas and also in the urban areas, so to speak, in some sense, that there is a kind of disciplinarization that comes to quasi-sovereign agencies, right? They mirror each other. State violence and counter-state violence often mirror each other. And that this infiltrates into the minutiae of everyday life. And this is where I think in some ways, if you think about the Kashmiri men at the end who are kind of brutalizing this woman, right? The poignant thing at this point of time is that she calls them brothers, right? Which of course has a particular significance if we think about it from the standpoint of, let's say, independentist, frameworks. That brother, to be called brother, like Fanon says, to be called brother, to be called this thing, is to take part in the soul of the revolution, right? Here it in fact becomes a weird kind of inversion, if you may think of it that way. That there's this peculiar way in which this kind of breakdown of trust in the framework of everyday life also seeps into very ordinary situations. And here too, when you're looking, for instance, at the closure, right? If you take away, let's say, like you said, if you take away the necropolitical conditions, this kind of chasing by dogs is something we see very commonly across streets in India and so on and so forth, right? Yet, in this very ordinary situation itself, this question of the brutality of sovereign violence keeps on repeating itself. And I think this is where the question of the bleed of the biopolitical and the zoopolitical come in the sense that when we talk about sovereign biopolitics, right, in some sense, it's always about surveillance, control, and so on and so forth. But the potentiality of the animal self kind of being torn and taken out of that human mask is always there. And I think that operates at different levels, I think, in this text and elsewhere as well, so to speak. Susan.
Yeah, I just wanted to know a bit more about how you look at necropolitics in this text, because the way Membe uses the way Membe talks about it, he does look at the everyday aspects of violence and terror, and also the affective aspects, and he goes through Badai to do that. But I've also felt that when you're looking at any war or any crisis laid in place, then Membe's theory is a bit totalizing, as in the explanation fits so neatly. And so I wanted to know, you mentioned briefly that you try to move beyond that. So I want to know how exactly you work with that formulation.
For this essay and also the other one that I sent you, the one which will be out soon, the key segment I think in the Mbembe piece really is the question of late modern colonial occupation, right? That segment on late modern colonial occupation, where of course Mbembe is specifically taking the case of Palestine, right? And talking about, like, for instance, spatial occupation in Palestine. He's drawing a lot on A.L. Weizmann's idea of the verticality and different layers to which. But the major thing which comes up, and it's interesting that that's also the point where he kind of rereads Fanon's kind of spatial architectonics, if you may put it that way, right? And that's, I think, something which is far more useful for me in this particular essay than that earlier section about, death as excess in Bataille, which of course is kind of like the linchpin of this essay, if you may put it in some ways, the economy of sacrifice and so on and so forth, right? And also this question of excessiveness and absolute expenditure. But I think the key bit which fascinates me here, and I think it also comes into a lot of the critical Kashmir scholars whom I engage with in both the essays, is this section of late modern colonial occupation. What happens, for instance, when you are traversing through colonized space, right? Where you are always a body under watch, so to speak, in some way. And what fascinates me, of course, in Munnu is these images of barbed wire, right? These images of barbed wire constantly coming in. It's like, I mean, in a way, it's like you can probably see the kind of influence of that also in the reading the second part of Ethics and Politics of Post-Colonial Animalities, where I talk of Battle of Algiers, which is the whole, you have this whole question of going through colonized space with barbed wires and so on and so forth. So this barbed wire marking a kind of interesting kind of opposition between inside and outside in the text constantly, right, is something which I find very fascinating in that text. And I think this is where the Mbembe kind of late modern colonial occupation, that kind of gaze becomes very fundamental. But there too, it's so interesting that the contrast again comes between, there's a scene at the beginning, there's a panel in the beginning where you have a quote unquote militant being trained, probably in one of the border areas, as the militant is walking, trying to kind of squeeze through this barbed wire. And you can see almost like the body is kind of sequestered in within that narrow space. This is kind of counterpointed with a later sequence, right, where the stray dogs seem to be moving without a care inside the barbed wires, right? Again, this space is so interesting that it's not completely like a border with a clearly marked inside and outside, but there is that space within the barbed wire itself. But these stray dogs, which of course you could say that yes, they are kind of nurtured by the army as guards, they are fed, and that's why they kind of bark at anyone who comes near. But there are also those dogs that kind of merge and walk through those spaces pretty easily that humans cannot, right? And this is where in some ways the relative scale of the human versus the animal also becomes interesting to think about in terms of necropolitical conditions itself. Maybe one of those ways in which animal agency and a certain kind of fugitive element in the animal also manifests itself, which is where I find Mbembe's theory a little limiting, partially because in a lot of ways he does talk about various technologies of control, various technologies to which the body is surveilled and so on. He does talk a little bit about agency at the end, especially when he talks about the bones, when he talks, for instance, about ecstasy, the logic of sacrifice versus the logic of freedom. I can't remember the titles at the end very much. But the problematic of agency in Mbembe's necropolitics is very, if you think about it, it's not very well explored. It seems to be kind of short-circuited at the end, if you may put it, right? And it seems to me that when we think of necropolitics, just like the snail that is almost like the living dead, but kind of comes back to life, while the kids are kind of, occupied with the corpse, trying to bring the corpse up back to life, the snail starts moving. So it gives you a different sense of life and living, even in necropolitical conditions. One that is not limited to the human alone, but also encompasses other beings, right? I mean, this is, in a way, you could call it like the classic question of whether human worlds are meant only for us, or do we share it with other beings, so to speak, in some ways. And I think this kind of move I find interesting, both in terms of thinking not only about animal agency as heralds of freedom, but for the ways in which they can also connect with certain human modes of being as a way of surviving and probably even to some extent transcending necropolitical conditions. That's the whole move beyond Mbembe that I would like to make. So not just the control, not just, let's say, necro power and politics over the human being, right? But within those conditions itself, formations of survival. I think in my recent work on the Anthropocene, this is something that has kind of interested me more, that in some ways, how would you kind of think, for instance, about forms of survival in worlds which seem in some sense not to have too much hope for living? I was just screening, to go off topic, for my climate change class, I was just screening the anime movie Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. And there was a beautiful line at that point where Yubaba, who's the old woman, who says, this world is not only meant for us, we have to cohabit with these insects, so to speak. And this cohabitation, this kind of living with or living together, if you will take it in the Haraway sense, is what I think this graphic novel, many of these stories also gesture towards, kind of like a kind of fugitive herald of freedom, so to speak, in some ways. And I think that's where, the necropolitical aspect could become critiqued in terms of thinking about it more as a kind of control over life in some way. Sorry, but I'm going on and on, but I'll stop here. Sorry.
before I pose my next question, I just wanted to ask the others also, remind them that if they have questions or comments, they can just unmute themselves and if you want to speak or raise a hand and we'll take your questions gladly. Looking at the frames that you've shared in your article from Munnu, as well as reading your article, I was struck by the fact that the dogs are not just there as a contrast to the hungals or to the humans, nor are they just there as symbolic presences. But what they seem to be doing very often is also watching what's going on. And I found this canine gaze upon the going ons, the goings on, really interesting also. And I wondered what role they play within the graphic novel, how you see that, and how you approach the stray dog in this novel, in this graphic novel, as witness to what's going on there.
There's a particular segment in the essay where I talk about, for instance, the stray dogs teetering ambivalently between spaces of life and death, right? I mean, of course, we could go through this symbolically as well. I mean, think about stories like, Yudhishthir walking to heaven with the dog, not being let in, but then finally he doesn't want to leave the dog. So it's kind of like this dog following, dog following the human after the space of life into an ambiguous space of death, so to speak, in some ways. But the dogs are interesting kind of non-human witnesses to a lot of other things as well, right? The scene where the gaze becomes the strongest is, for instance, when you have that person who's prostrate, right, with his arms flailing all around, and you have the dogs looking almost stunned from the distance, so to speak, in some ways, right? They are in some sense witnessing what the question of violence done to the human in these necropolitical conditions are going on. The second thing could be like when, for instance, he goes with his girlfriend Paisley to smoke weed in one of those abandoned temples, right? It's all dark, right? And suddenly the dogs come out. So they think of that space as completely abandoned. But look at this, it's not abandoned. It is actually being occupied by other forms of life. You have dogs, you have insects, and in fact, insects, there could be a whole paper probably even written about insects, for instance, in Munnu, the representation of insects in Munnu, right? They are there at different points of time, spiders and so on and so forth, because these are things that I noticed later on. But the way in which we think about certain things, certain spaces, certain ruins, so to speak, as spaces of death, and spaces of death because they are devoid of human presence, right? We think of them, it's like thinking about the desert as a space of death because it's supposedly devoid of human presence. But of course, there are humans there, but there are other animals there as well. And they live there and they witness things that are going there as well, so to speak, in some sense, right? So there's a way in which constantly this aspect of human habitation is constantly complicated by how, for instance, other beings also inhabit the city. Other beings inhabit abundant spaces. Other beings, so to speak, in some sense, also inhabit spaces that kind of get associated rather with spaces of emptiness or death, which is why one of the contrasts that I tried to draw in that section was that segment from Basharat Pir's memoir, where he talks, for instance, about one of these temples. Again, kind of, it's all empty but stray dogs. It's all empty but stray dogs, right? Which means it's not empty. There are stray dogs there who are living, so to speak. There are stray dogs there who are living their lives, who are probably in some sense witnessing different things. But that element becomes very, very, very fundamental in the story. The other way of looking at it, of course, is this question of the non-human witness as well. And I was really fascinated by one essay by Daniel Williams. It's an essay actually on the stones in Coetzee's Dusklands, right? And the stones as witnesses, right? How do you talk about the question of the stones as witnesses? This question of the non-human witness becomes very fundamental, right? Because again, you could talk about the stones, for instance, in Coetzee's Duskland. Recently, I was teaching Alexis Wright's wonderful novel, The Swan Book, where the tree becomes a witness to scenes of violence, and the tree is then cut down, right? So how do you actually talk about this notion of the non-human witness? This idea that the non-human has a certain amount of personhood through which they witness, so to speak, acts of tremendous violence going on elsewhere and so on. And this, I think, comes up very clearly in that last sequence, which we already touched upon, because one of the scenes is that as the woman is thrown out, the dogs are looking at her, right? The dogs are looking at her, and she looks back at the dog, right? She looks back at the dogs, and it's that exchange of gazes and also that haptic kind of contact, which leads to that ultimate. And then she sings this lullaby, and one of the dogs falls silent, and the other dogs are looking at her, right? Now, this could, of course, be read archetypally in a certain way, if you think about it, right? But it could also be read in some ways as a mutual exchange of gazes, not only the human looking at the dog, but the dog looking back at the human, and a kind of contact which comes at that point, right? And a kind of both visual, haptic, and also sonic kind of contact which comes at that point. And I think this idea that in some sense, initially her language is called gibberish, right? But then she croons to the dogs, puts them to sleep. And I think that becomes interesting to think about, both in terms of these mutual exchange of gazes and the contact, the interspecies contact that happens there. So yeah, there are multiple modalities, I think, of this notion of witnessing, of non-human witnessing, right? And I would extend this not only to talk about dogs, but also to other non-human entities, right? Whether we think, for instance, stones, or for that matter, trees and so on, right? How do you witness, for instance, events which seemed to reverberate with all these examples of violence and so on? But how do you actually talk about an ethical frame of witnessing from that framework? But I see a hand there as well. Maybe I can answer that question.
Yeah, Rukmini, please go ahead.
So my question is, a couple of questions are not theoretical. They are simply naive questions, if you will. And
also, you know, your video's turned off. I don't know if you.
Video is turned off. Let me try turning it on. Is this better?
Yes,
yes.
I see you.
Okay. So, so the question I wanted to ask is first about the. My interest is in language and in linguistics. So, my question is about the genre of the graphic novel, which a lot of the Kashmiri artists tend to use, which actually renegotiates the boundaries between speech and visual or haptic perception. So why do you think that the genre, and this is not the only Kashmiri, right? Many
sure.
Choose this, who deliberately choose this genre. And so my first question was, what do you think the genre does in its presentation of form, the form of the animal, the form of writing, the movement of narrative? What does it do which the novel, the classical novel, does not do? So that's my first, and it's quite a simple question. But the second type of question is, you know, you said, I think I heard you say that I haven't really read any Kashmiri novels. This is the first one. Did you say that?
No, I said I'm not a specialist in Kashmiri literature. I've read others, yes, but I mean, I would consider myself more like working on Northeastern literature. So just a marked positionality question, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, about Kashmir, what I wanted to say is that Rushdie, of course, is taken to be one of the most former spokesmen for Kashmir. And he says that he visualizes himself as a dog, and specifically Saul Bellow's dog in the Dean's December, saying to God, for God's sake, just open up the universe.
Yeah.
So and then later on in Rushdie, you have a stuffed dog called Jawahar. And so in those cases, the dog, in the Jawahar case, the dog is very domesticated. Whereas in the Kashmiri case, this is clearly not the case. The domesticated element in the novel that you described is sought to be discarded. So I wanted to know whether this how does domestication versus animality, because animality covers a range of
flavors. Yeah.
How do you negotiate it? And the third question is just personal. I mean, I have written with a Kashmiri friend of mine, Ashraf Bhatt, on stone pelting, which, like the barbed wire, is a very common image. And we analyzed it through interviews and so on as the inability to speak, so a kind of weakness which characterized the situation in Kashmir, because many Kashmir, I didn't even know you carried ID cards in Kashmir till I learned the deep resentment and the inability to speak back to the perpetrators, or who may be from Bihar or Tamil Nadu or something, asking the Kashmiri for the ID card in his land. So there I wanted to ask the perpetrator, the state, the necropolitical state or whatever you want to call it, the animality of the person who asks for the ID card cannot cognitively be thrown or flung on the ground. So that person remains human under all circumstances. What do you think is the logic of that? So those were
Thank you so much. These are wonderful questions, and I will try to answer them in sequence. Let me begin first of all with the genre question, right? What is it that the genre of the graphic novel does, which the novel does not quite achieve in some ways?
Especially
in the Kashmiri, and I'm going to talk about the other graphic novel that I've written about, right, which is the little fragment from This Side, That Side by Arif Ayaz Pare and Wasim Hilal, which is called Tamasha Tetwal, which is kind of a critique of Manto, right? But the interesting thing that they do there, first of all, is how they show, number one, the question of bodily movement across panels, not just human movement, but also animal movement, right? The first, if you think about the first page of the graphic fragment, right, because it's just a small chapter there, right? The dog's body is divided into two, again, in some ways, kind of separated by the gutter, right? So it shows like a fluid movement across panels, while the humans seem to be sequestered in place, right? While the animal is moving smoothly, the humans seem to be positioned, for instance, in two discrete panels, so to speak, in some ways, right? So again, one way of showing, for instance, and this comes up a lot in Munnu as well, I think, also in the Saurabh Singh, the Kashmir pending graphic novel, so to speak, in some ways. But the questions about constrictions of movement and the fluidity of movement very often comes to a certain experimentation with, let's say, panels and gutters, right? So you have certain bodies that are sequestered in particular panels. You have bodies that can move, or at least have that illusion of moving, so to speak, within gutters, so to speak. Language, right? Since you talked about the question of language and speech and how, for instance, that can be depicted, the advantages of, let's say, the graphic novel versus again, I go back to Tamasha Tetwal, right? Which, again, to show the spatial division between India and Pakistan, right, has two kind of panels separated by a gutter with loudspeakers on both sides. One loudspeaker, the letters are in Hindi, right? The other one is in Urdu. So clearly, again, talking about nationalist propaganda, but again, through the division of space, so to speak, in some sense, right? It also uses, for instance, the question of photographs as memorial objects very interestingly, right? So let's say in the beginning of that graphic novel, just speaking on the corner of, let's say, one of the panels is something called Harnam Singh file, which is, of course, going back to Manto, Harnam Singh being one of the major characters in Tetwal Ke Kutte, right? Harnam Singh files. And then there is this image, for instance, of a bird that is flying over a river, which is, again, brought back at the end. Now, if you remember, for instance, the beginning of Manto's story, it says, everything is quiet in the Tetwal Valley, then there's a shot, and then the birds start flying out. So you have actually animal presences before the dogs that come out. So this agitated birds that are flying out. Now you have this mute capture by a photograph. If you think about the photograph as a form of living death in some sense. Now, if you take it out of context, it looks like a white bird which is flying, which becomes simply a symbol of peace, right? Flying over the Kishanganga River. On one side is India, on the other side is Pakistan. You can kind of sell this almost. You can consume this object almost in some sense as this white bird flying, as this whole image of peace. But if you think of the other angle, the bird was simply agitated, right? And just flying somewhere in between and just caught in that no man land in between. So there's this other reading also possible that comes through visuality, right? Again, through this intertextual reference, if you may put it to Monto's story. But if you if you bring the story and that photograph together, multiple meanings emerge just from that simple photograph itself. And I said, I think the photographer would capture, oh, natural beauty, the bird flying, the bird is white like a dove, symbol of peace, right? So that's the way in which it could be consumed. But it takes away the sonic background, the fact that nationalist propaganda is blaring from both sides, that there are shots being fired from both sides, and these are shocking the birds, and they're kind of suspended in between. So this could be a terrified bird, as opposed to, let's say, a bird which in some sense becomes a symbol of peace in that sense. And this, I think, is something that the visual medium gives us, which allows us to mine ambiguities which are not necessarily possible in the written word. So that's the question of language.
Maybe not
Would
realized in a which
verbally, yeah, absolutely. And I think other modalities of interpretation, whether we say haptic, whether we imagine the sonic, because we can of course imagine the sonic, I think, even in written text as well, right? Texts about the Anthropocene, which constantly talk, for instance, about animal silences in forests, right? So I mean, we can imagine that. But I think the question of bringing different sensual registers together in the graphic novel allows for these multiple levels of interpretation. So that would be my first response to your genre question, right? My second response to the dog question about the domesticated, I'll begin first of all with the domesticated and the stray animal question, right? Now, one part, of course, is that on the one hand, pet keeping in India, if we think about it, right, has also interestingly imploded as a kind of neoliberal practice. I think this Mona and Purnima Bose are absolutely correct that if you think about it in terms of pet keeping, I mean, growing up in the 80s, we hardly saw, for instance, pet spas or something on those lines, particular types of breeds coming up, right? The question of domestication has been there, of course, in the in the South Asian context, if I may say, but it's kind of imploded through the pet industry, so to speak, in the last 20 years or so, right? Even given that framework, so to speak, there are regions, for instance, where there could be taboos about keeping domesticated animals, especially dogs and so on. And in fact, when Athar Zia wrote her essay on dogs, one of the first things she begins with is that, like, the taboo of keeping, for instance, dogs as pets in Kashmir, right? So on the one hand, there's of course that taboo, that antipathy, but the fact is that relationships with stray dogs always oscillate between the wild and the domesticated, right? They're never really wild, they're never really domesticated, but they teeter in that ambiguous zone in between. And this is true even if you think about Tetwal Ke Kutte. The dog arrives from somewhere, you don't know whose dog it is, you don't know its prior history, it's a stranger that comes from somewhere, you offer it conditional hospitality for a while, that hospitality is taken away, but he's teetering constantly between the status of what you would call the domesticated and the wild. So clearly, in some sense, in the context of Kashmir itself, talking even about stray dogs has to come into that context. Like, let's say there are these stray dogs on the streets that are, for instance, cared for by the army people, and that's how they're talked about as tools, for instance, of the Indian army, right? They become almost like domesticated dogs, but they are stray dogs. They're this peculiar liminal position. The same thing goes with the locals, right? On the one hand, they could be disgusted with the dogs as tools of Indian occupation, but they could care about the dogs in their mohallas and so on and so forth, at the end of the streets and so on, right? So there are these multiple kind of relationships which cannot be put into this continuum of pets versus wild, which kind of teeters somewhere ambiguously in between. And I think a graphic novel like Munnu explores that kind of multiple relationalities that come with dogs at different points of time. Both the fear being chased by the dogs, the question of domestication, of course, in Rushdie, the domesticated dog Jawahar, clearly there's an element of satire going on there as well. But I'd like to end with this portion of the question with one other dimension that we can think of, right? Which is this phrase like a dog, right? Which, for instance, when we say like a dog, or even let's say someone like Manto ending with kutte ki maut, isko kutte ki maut diya gaya, right? Like he was a shaheed or he was a kutte ki maut, right? Which means a particularly meaningless form of death. Kutte ki maut means a valueless death, so to speak, in some sense, which means that within a certain imaginary, I wouldn't call this only South Asian, dogs in that animacy hierarchy fall pretty low, right? That in some sense, to be equated with a dog is to be equated almost as subhuman. But I did read an interesting essay which made me think about this phrase differently. This was by the scholar Kalina Chiobanu, who wrote this essay on Coetzee's Disgrace, where Lucy says, forget the main character's name. He says, "You want to live here like a dog?" And she says, "Yes, I want to live here like a dog." And she says something interesting. If you put the accent on the like a dog, we are talking about the animacy hierarchy. The dog is lower than the human. However, if we put a dog instead of a life of a like, right, we are actually kind of going into a dog's way of being, which is an alter way of being, of existing in this universe, so to speak, in some ways, right? And I think this becomes an interesting way in which an animal perspective, just like the disability perspective and what we talked about, the connection between disability and animality, it kind of overturns the way we think about animals itself, because the way we think about animals is always as subhuman, that to be like a dog is not to be like a human. But if you focus on a dog and its way of being, there are modalities of existence which are altered. And I think that becomes very interesting also in that last sequence that we talked about with the disabled woman and the dogs and the interspecies contact. This was the second way I tried to read that sequence in this essay that I sent to Anu. And to briefly end with your last question, which was about the other side, which is the human who dispenses it. I think here we have to talk about images of humanity, or not humanity, images of the human in connection with the idea of the sovereign, right? Because in some sense, when you say that, let's say the army man will never be thrown on the ground, he's the one who throws you on the ground. Here, an image of the human is coming to an image of I am sovereign over you, right? I am sovereign over you, who's there as bare life, so to speak, in some sense, right? And this is a particular image of the human, which I think becomes very fundamental to think about in necropolitical conditions, right? Where even petty sovereigns, let's put it that way, like the person at the checkpoint, the police officer for that matter, would say, I am more human than you because I can exercise absolute control over your life and death at this point, so to speak, in some ways. Of course, you can think about racial violence here in the United States. A similar logic, I think, operates here with police violence against Black bodies, so to speak, right? We can talk, for instance, about army situations around the world, but this image of the human as the absolute sovereign, that I, in some sense, can separate myself from you and exercise absolute power over you as object. I think this is the key bit for which, in some sense, you cannot quite cancel this from this question of sovereignty. Yeah. So that would be my answer, Sam.
Thank you.
I just had a follow-up question on what you just said and what you mentioned earlier. And I'm thinking about the necropolitical again. And, you mentioned briefly in the essay how in post-colonial literatures, the tendency is to read them as symbols or metaphors and not as actual material bodies. And then you go on to quote that sentence from the Veena Das essay about how you can have access to another form of life's intimacy and have intimacy without knowing much about the form of life as such. And it seems to me that in these necropolitical frameworks, there are always certain beings or certain animal beings who play a significant role in the death worlds, but have worked into their constitution itself some kind of multiplicity. So whether it is the stray dog who is not a single stray dog, but the stray dog
Exactly.
who can proliferate or who may be
Mm,
packed. But even in the Nausicaa movie, the
mm,
Omu, right? Like
mm,
in case of any insect, behind the insect, there's many more
many more.
insects.
Yeah.
And if the multiplication of that kind is central to the position of the animal in a necropolitical context,
Mm,
then could it also suggest that the multiplication is also a kind of growth or
mm,
a proliferation,
mm,
which which would destabilize how we perceive the hierarchy itself.
mm,
It
mm,
would undercut the hierarchy in some way.
mm, mm,
So
mm,
I'm wondering what you think of that.
Fascinating question. And again, I'll try to answer this in two different perspectives, right? One is that in necropolitical conditions, what are the type of animals that we usually focus on, right? Very often, these are animals that we share interests with. And here I go back to one of your earlier speakers, Neela Huja, who says that in some sense, when you talk, for instance, about animal studies, right, we have largely been kind of, you know, interested in animals with whom we share certain interests in common. Dogs could be one of them, cats could be others, right? I mean, in many ways, domesticated animals or even bovines or so on and so forth, right? Goats and so on and so forth, right? There's a way in which we can definitely think of, because even within necropolitical literature, the focus is on conditions of human life, let's say, right? The focus is very much on conditions of human life and the relationships of the animal that come in contact with it, so to speak, right? So that's where a multiplicity of symbolic meanings accrue to the animal, but also these kind of multiplicities that you're talking about, these kind of elements that kind of elude any form of biopolitical or necropolitical control, so to speak, in some ways, with those animals with which we share interests. But what about animals we don't share interests with, right? This becomes a much more challenging question, so to speak, right? What about animals whom we even find hostile, who live within necropolitical conditions, but are actually inhabitants of those necropolitical conditions themselves, right? And it's interesting that you talk about the omu and the whole multiplicity of insects, so to speak, behind it, right? There are all these smaller insects when they go, for instance, when you see the first approach to Pejite, right? It's just like the dead insects right outside the city. So, but the smaller ones, finally you go and see the massive kind of sublime omu, right, so to speak. There are all these small minions that die first of all, but seem almost to be forms of life which are not really thought about within that framework. And I do think the challenge to think beyond necropolitics would be to go to another speaker of yours, Mick Smith, whose essay I've really admired at different points of time, is how to think, for instance, about these quote unquote insignificant others, but also in some sense others that we may find hostile within our own conditions. Animals like rats, animals, for instance, like insects and so on and so forth. And I do think that in thinking about the live space of the city, to think that we share it, for so to speak, with multiple forms of life, multiple forms of animal life, which is such a weird word itself, the word animal, because whenever I begin my animal studies classes, sorry to go on a detour, I begin with the Nietzsche essay, Truth and Lying in an Extra Moral Sense, because here's the classic metaphor that does violence. The elephant is an animal, the insect is an animal. So the paradox would be to ask my students, don't draw an animal, draw animal, so to speak. And then, the whole question comes up, what exactly does this word animal mean, right? You have this whole multiplicity of other animals, some of them inimical, so to speak, to human ways of living, so to speak. But they are also, as I said, kind of coming within this framework of what we call human modes of existence, which are threatened by necropolitical conditions, which is why I would say that the question of thinking about the animal also has to force and go beyond the question of human sovereignty itself. We have to start thinking that in some sense, the world that we inhabit is not the world that is made only for us, but that we are sharing with other beings, like I came back to earlier. And I think this could open up multiple ways of thinking about how space is lived. Like let's say, for instance, if you're thinking about a city like New York, you have different levels, the ruins being inhabited by rats, it's part of the city as well, right? How do you write that into living in the city, so to speak, in some sense? And I think this is where the question of the human can be kind of refracted through the other animals that live alongside us. So I would say, on the one hand, with the question of necropolitics, we would always be, and this goes back to post-colonial theory as well, that we are, of course, and we should be in some sense, focused on human frames of living, of human world making and its destruction, so to speak, in some ways. But where post-colonial theory can also look or go beyond is beyond this question of human worlds, to think about more than human worlds and how they come into contact with each other. And that, I think, is part of the question that we can kind of keep on unbinding more and more. Rukmini, yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I find it irresistible because I've been trying to think on Susan's behalf about the repeated phrase that she uses in this entire series about a multi-species planet in terms of all insects. But I thought of reversing it and found that Elon Musk uses this phrase, which is multi-planetary species, which means that rather than a multi-species planet, a multi-planetary species. And I think that's very interesting because he's talking about human beings escaping a potentially dying planet and going to other, other planets. So the human being as evolving into a multi-planetary species seems to me a very nice mirror to the idea of a multi-species planet, which is, which is always used. And I just wondered, since it just struck me during your conversation, I've been trying to think about it, and I wondered whether you or Susan had any comments on it.
Susan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I didn't expect to be put on the spot. I don't have any responses.
Okay, I'll try to answer this in two different ways without agreeing with Elon Musk, right? Whom I don't want to agree with.
That's a good strategy.
Very smart phrase, that one.
Yeah. Let me put it this way, that, I kind of, since I've been working more on the questions of the Anthropocene right now, I kind of like one of the moves. I think Dipesh Chakrabarty, some of what he says about the Anthropocene can be very problematic, but some of what he says actually opens up some very interesting questions as well, right? And in that essay, I think in his Tanner lectures, it was probably in his Tanner lectures, he says, for instance, how the Anthropocene begins as a study of comparative planets, right? I mean, if you think even for, so to speak, about the Gaia hypothesis, or people like Jan Zalasiewicz, that many of them were trained as comparative planetary studies. So in many ways, when you think about the Anthropocene and when you think about planetarity, right, think about the image of the Earth being seen from the moon, which kind of, which is taken away by Lonely Planet as kind of this consumer image. But we may think about this as a kind of tectonic shift as well, in thinking about our placement in the universe from the outside, the first image that comes from the outside. So this comparative planetary studies, I think, and especially when we think, for instance, about Anthropocene and deep time into the future, we are thinking about a planetary history where planetary life itself may end on this planet. We are burned to toast, not necessarily for human activity, but because of planetary processes itself, so to speak, right? So there's a way in which, yes, I would probably say that if we begin to think of the Anthropocene in that way, right, we are already probably a multi-planetary species, probably, but not in the way Elon Musk reads it. And the reason why I would not agree with Elon Musk is that I think we still have only one world to live in, right? We have to think about this world rather than exiting, so to speak, in some sense. This is a classic fantasy of exiting a world which is quote unquote dying, but dying also for whom? This is also a question, right? I mean, and I think a lot of climate change fictions ask this question as well, that when we say dying, arts of dying on a planet like like that book which came out from by Roy Scranton. I can't remember the title exactly, right? But dying for whom, right? Is it just the question of human species dying? Because I kind of like this N.K. Jemisin statement in the 5th season where she says, worlds have always ended, but the planet still goes on, right? The planet still goes on, right? And the question of planetary life, in some sense, that we are one species among many, that we are one species among many, and that we are sharing our life with other beings, so to speak, in some sense, and that we have one world to live in. So maybe one of the ways of thinking about emancipatory imaginaries, so to speak, would be to think about this world rather than these escapist fantasies. So it seems to me that while the Anthropocene can be productively thought of as a multi-planetary kind of species imaginary, it can also be taken into this kind of framework where he's selling you this fantasy that you spend $100,000. Oh, it's nothing, $100,000. Take a plane to Mars and then escape this planet, right? That's what he was saying the other day. And the ticket to this plane is like $100,000 or so on. And so, I mean, that I think is a load of bullshit. But I'll keep my comments and my swearing limited to that for that matter.
Right. Yeah, it is just a thought. I haven't thought it through, so.
Yeah. No, I think there are two different dimensions, as I said, that come up. And I would agree with you that it's not just planetarity, it's a multi-planetarity, because clearly I think the question of the Anthropocene brings us to the question of comparative planetary life as well. So we are a comparative planetary species, if you may put it that way, if we find forms of species. And the question of life too, I mean, the imagining is so much within human encounters that very often we may have met life but never recognized it, so to speak, right? This is, I mean, the science fiction fantasy would always be about forms of life that are translatable to human encounters. But what about forms of life that we cannot even imagine, so to speak, in some ways,
That's
right?
true.
And I think the question and it's a fascinating question, as I said, I think more than planetarity, this multi-planetarity question becomes very fundamental in the Anthropocene thing.
Right.
Although, as I said, it's always available for co-optation by Elon Musk and co. in different ways, in ways I wouldn't agree with.
Yes. We got some political critique in there, Susan.
Well, we just have time for one final question. And Amit, I'd like to request you in the course of your response to this. Well, it's not exactly a question, but you were kind enough to share with me your upcoming article, Dogs of War, War Dogs, the Afterlife of Munnu, in 2 Kashmiri graphic novels. And in your present article, the one that we've discussed today, you've also dealt with the intertextual references to Munnu's Dogs of Tetwal. Sure. So, for the benefit of those of us here who weren't fortunate enough, like Susan and me, to have read the upcoming article, perhaps you could tell us a little about what to expect. Give us a little foretaste.
This article, which is coming out in the Critical Kashmir Studies Reader in August, actually originated as a very angry response to the Pulwama attack and the Indian government's response to it. Right, I'd written a short piece in the webzine Riot on it, and kind of trying to bring that was more like a hastily written piece, which was kind of almost like a visceral response to what was going on, the nationalist drum beating at that time and all that, right? So this prior to the 2019 elections. In between, I think of these 3 essays as a kind of triptych, right? The Endangered and Endangering Species being the first one, Ethics and Politics of Post-Colonial Animalities, the second one, with the first portion specifically. And then, of course, this one, which kind of brings these things together along with the Hilal and Pare comic fragment that I was talking about with Rukmini briefly earlier. So it came out from there, and I thought there were a couple of things I did not address very well in either of my 2 iterations on the Endangered and Endangering Species and the essay on Munnu's Dog of Tetwal. The most important thing there was thinking through the question of the persona, which is what I was talking about here, the legal persona that is often given, so to speak, by status instruments, right, like ID cards and so on, which works in an interesting metaphorical way in the Tetwal Ki Kutte story, when you have that little play card being put, this is an Indian dog or this is a Pakistani dog, right? It's almost like an endowment of a quasi-legal persona to the dog, which is then stripped away, right? And then the dog simply becomes, their life in both senses, both as a metaphor for, let's say, refugees being caught in the no man's land, but also as an animal body, which is simply thought of as valueless, which goes back to that final play between Shahid and Kutte Ki Maut. And this kind of brought me also to certain things in Munnu that I think I hadn't read, as I said, which was this question of like a dog, right? What does it mean to put the accent on the like? What does it mean to put the accent on a dog? Where I tried to reread both the scene of Munnu prostrating himself almost on all fours through the first dimension through the like, and the last section, the ambiguous conclusion, through this notion of this alter mode of being, not this interspecies connection, but alter modes of being, so to speak. What does disability and animality, if we do not think of them as metaphors, because post-colonial literature in general is kind of guilty of thinking of both disability and animality largely through metaphor, right? I mean, Claire Barker has written about disability. You can think about animality in its various aspects. So definitely it was a way to try to think about those frames. And then I went on to talk about Tamasha Tetwal, which is the segment from this side, that side, both its critique of Manto, because in a way, Manto kind of subsumes the Kashmiri identity within the Indian and Pakistani identity without thinking about the specificity of Kashmir as a locale. And that's the major critique which is being made by Pare and Hilal in that comic book, in a comic fragment. And of course, thinking a little bit about the life of the stray dog. But one of the other things which began to strike me, and this was, of course, this comes a lot through teaching as well, is the constant reference, for instance, to Joe Sacco in Munnu. And in fact, it seems to me there's an interesting kind of repose going on to Joe Sacco as well, because the chapter which talks about the chapter which talks about the history, the necropolitical history of Kashmir, which I said that the Hanguls are four-legged on the frames, and then they start walking up, and then it gives you this kind of like, flicker history, so to speak, of Kashmir from like mythical times down to the present, right? Which is a direct reference to Joe Sacco's footnotes in Gaza, where he says that so history does not like its footnotes, right? There are those which the history which is put up, this history which is put out there, places like Gaza always fall down on the footnotes. I'm kind of paraphrasing from there, but there's a way in which there's this contested relationship with Sacco as well, through which Manto is critiqued in obliquely in Munnu, because Manto again does not talk about Kashmir, right? In some ways that he relegates it more to the footnotes. So I used, in a way, Sacco to critique Manto as well. So that was the whole argument in the essay, that it tried to look in two angles. One, of course, is to think through the question of hospitality, the question of the animality, for instance, in Manto, how it gets reconfigured in these two graphic novels, but how these two graphic novels, the Kashmiri graphic novels, actually in different ways, Hilal and Pare directly, whereas I would say someone like Sajad more obliquely critique Manto for the erasure of Kashmir as well. So that's the essay that is coming out. So hopefully after this, I won't write about Munnu ever again.
I hope not. I mean, I hope you will, basically. So a double no there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amit.
Thank you.
This was a pleasure talking to you today, and we look forward. I know the article already. The others look forward to its publication so that they can get it as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody else who's been here for the talk. We'll be back next week with another edition of Table Talk. See you then, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.